Okay, welcome to the side event co-organized by the Bolivian government together with the Third World Network. On the panel will be, apart from um, Dr. Professor Fadhel Kaboub from Power Shift Africa, there's also me, who is Meena Raman from the Third World Network, the head of programs. And we are also waiting for Mr. Diego Pacheco, who is the head of delegation of Bolivia and who's also the spokesperson for the like-minded developing countries. And we've also waiting for Ambassador Nasr of Egypt, and I hope he will be here. Many of you have come to this event wanting to find out about what is happening in the process or not happening as the why am I hearing an echo? Yeah. You may be wondering what's happening or not happening. Whenever the last few days, last few hours, when the press asked me about it, I keep saying it's a trillion dollar question. And so we really have no idea as yet. As you know, that the most important outcome of Baku is on finance, the new collective quantified goal on finance. For those of you who are not aware about the Third World Network, we publish daily briefings about all the negotiating teams. We have produced quite a number. Please visit our website and you will see details about the state of play in terms of those negotiations. But on the new collective quantified goal on finance, right now, the ministerial process is taking place with ministers talking to various parties and groups regarding the quantum of the goal, regarding whether it should be a single layer or whether it should be a multi-layer. For those of you who are wondering what all these layers are, there is this big push by the developed world to talk about investment goal. So instead of a collective quantified goal on finance from developed to developing countries, they're talking about investments. And the other, of course, is the contributor base. By what that means is that developed countries want developing countries to also contribute to the new collective quantified goal. That in itself is a big problem, because this is not about the mandate. Actually is for a new collective quantified goal from developed to developing countries. That's what they are supposed to discuss. It's not developing countries contributing, because in the Paris Agreement, anything that others do apart from the developed countries is voluntary. It's not mandatory. Paris Agreement is very clear that the developed countries shall provide. Now, those of you who don't know English, because in a lot of the rooms, they don't read, they don't understand English, particularly those who come from the English world. So they say it's only voluntary, it's not mandatory. So we said, yeah, but look at Article 9.1, which is a shall obligation, and then Article 9.3, which is a mobilization of finance. Of course, developed countries taking the lead, and also they have to mobilize from their part of the world. So that's the state of play in terms of the new collective quantified goal. We don't know as yet. And tomorrow there will be a stock take, not the global stock take, it's the stock take of the what's going on. So we will be hearing where the negotiations are at much more clearer. The other thing, we are also waiting for our panelists to join so that I will give you a little bit of the big picture. The other issue is really on the mitigation issue. There's a lot of frustration, particularly from the developed world. Why are we not talking about mitigation ambition in the process? So you would hear this. Why don't we want to recall the 1.5? Why don't we want to have paragraphs on transitioning away from fossil fuels? This was the Dubai decision of paragraph 28. And yet when you go into the mitigation work program, there is an impasse. I just came from that session as well. What developing countries are saying, a significant number of developing countries are saying, look, the mandate is to be non-prescriptive. It's supposed to be a space where we have a safe discussion. There are global dialogues and investment-focused events. That's what is key in terms of exchanges. What we do not want is a process to actually turn the bottom-up process of nationally determined contributions, because that's what was agreed to in Dubai, that the GST, the global stocktake outcome, will inform parties in the preparations of the NDCs. So here they go. So it's supposed to inform the preparation of the NDC. So we'd like to see when their NDCs are produced by February next year, whether indeed the developed countries who are so interested in saving the planet, because they always say 1.5 aligned and so on and so forth. But I'm sure Diego will have a lot to say about that, because he's been in an intense process exposing that basically, if you look at the GST decision itself from Dubai, 4/5 of the carbon budget has already been exhausted since the pre-industrial era, which actually means that much of this overuse of the atmospheric space, particularly, is the responsibility of the developed world. And they have pre-2020 ambition gaps on mitigation that they have not fulfilled. There are many, many gaps of implementation that are there, including their finance obligation on the 100 billion per year. They say that they have achieved it, but when you look and interrogate the numbers, as Oxfam has done, you will see that there's only about 20 to 30 billion, which has been really real. A lot of it is actually counting loans, counting export credits, counting all kinds of numbers which shouldn't be counted as climate finance. So you do see that that in this process, there is this north-south divide, which is very stark. And for those of you who do not know about Third World Network's book, please, I'm not promoting this just to increase our income, but rather to show you that anybody who reads this will show that nothing really has changed. It really goes in circles. And so for many of us who come to these COPs, we ask ourselves, why do we come? But the point is, we have to be here. We have to hold governments to account, particularly the global north, and we have to expose and show who is really wrecking the planet. Is it the developing world, or is it the global north that refuses to own up to its responsibility? And the final thing I will say is that, of course, the big elephant in the room is really about the United States exit from the Paris Agreement, which they intend to do once the Trump administration comes in. And once again, the world's greatest historical emitter and current per capita emitter is going to abdicate responsibility. What this means is that, and of course, Donald Trump has said they're going to drill, baby, drill, which basically means they're going to continue the emissions, the fossil fuel production and emissions expansion. So what you will actually see that the growing need of developing countries for adaptation finance, for loss and damage finance, for the more emissions that are on the rise, the more the temperature rises, the less we are able to actually control what's going to happen in terms of adverse impacts of climate change. So we are at a very serious inflection point. And of course, Fadhel and others will talk more about finance, and including the crisis of debt that many developing countries are facing. So we are at a moment that we have to see where exactly we will land at the end of this COP. But I think for those of you who do not follow the negotiations, that we cannot allow Baku to not have an outcome on finance. This is a finance COP. So if anybody wants to talk about raising ambition on mitigation, our response is, where is the money? Because developing countries actually will need the money for the transition that they have to do. And so that is absolutely critical. So let's focus on where the spotlight ought to be. So with that, allow me to introduce Senor and Dr. Diego Pacheco, the head of delegation of Bolivia and the spokesperson for the like-minded developing countries. Over to you, Diego.
Meena, good afternoon, friends, colleagues, brothers, sisters. Yeah, I did really, this is an important opportunity to reflect on some of the key issues well being discussed in this COP. Well, reflections, what happened in the first week, the challenges for the second week, and well, what are the expectations also for Bolivia, the plurinational state Bolivia, but also for developing countries, since Bolivia is also speaking on behalf of the like-minded developing countries. Well, at the beginning of this COP, well, the presidency requested and plea all the parties to have a smooth approval of the agenda, and well, but this was not possible. We were engaged in a battle, really, in what we call the agenda fight, no? Fighting what topics will be included in the agenda and what other topics, well, there is no agreement among the parties and, well, will be go somewhere else, but not in the agenda. So at that point, also, well, the main interests of developed countries were manifest. We realized that there are two main purposes of developed countries in this COP, which, well, is not really a surprise because it's a continuation of previous attempts to first to continue this narrative of the 1.5 within reach and all the implications, to transfer the responsibilities from the developed to the developing countries. And this narrative started in Glasgow. And the second one, the most important in the context of this COP, which is a finance COP, is really to avoid any responsibility at all to provide financial resources, which is very contradictory with the objective of this COP, and contradictory also with the mandates of the convention and of the Paris Agreement. But this is the two main interests of developed countries. Of course, both of them are very much against the interests of developing countries and Bolivia as such. And well, in this agenda fight, we finally try to protect the interests of the developing countries and not to go into substantive decisions that can prejudge the process of the negotiation. So finally, the agenda was approved without prejudging the outcome of the negotiations in these two processes. Regarding mitigation, I want to start with mitigation. Well, what is happening in this COP, as I said, is the continuation of the narrative of developed countries introduced in Glasgow, the 1.5 within reach, which is, well, the objective, of course, is good. As Bolivia, we did support since the very beginning the 1.5 within reach. Was I can say, or it is a Bolivian position. But in Glasgow, Bolivia introduced a proposal for consideration in the agenda, which was precisely 1.5 within reach in the context of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities. That was the Bolivian proposal for Glasgow. But with the finally, with the presidency of the UK, try really hard to avoid that Bolivia would push for include this 1.5 with equity and CBDR in the agenda. And that Bolivia, always with the spirit of constructiveness, flexibility, we supported to the presidency to discuss this issue with good faith in the process of the negotiations. But the outcome of the Glasgow was to have the 1.5, but disconnecting from equity and CBDR. Because in Glasgow, developed countries started this process to deleting equity and CBDR from the understanding of the Paris agreement. And they started, I can say, very successfully with this narrative of the 1.5 within reach that have many countries supporting this. I cannot, well, see what we cannot support, this 1.5. But there is a problem behind this 1.5 within reach. In Glasgow, precisely, disconnecting this narrative from the equity and CBDR, the outcome of Glasgow, the Glasgow Climate Pact, put that against the spirit of the Paris Agreement that all parties, developed and developing countries, should reach net zero by 2050. All. No differentiation. We should all do our best to achieve net zero by 2050. And this is really against the Paris Agreement, because in the Paris Agreement, well, developing countries should achieve later in the second half of the century the net zero. But it was a great push for us to accept the outcome of Glasgow, and we supported in good faith also the net zero by 2050. But that has a lot of implications. The first implication is that, well, really we don't have a differentiation. The CBDR began to be diluted. And by reaching a zero by 2050, well, all parties should increase their level of ambition. That's the idea of the Glasgow narrative. And they push for this. And the second step in this narrative is inserted in Dubai in the first global stock take context. And they included the Para 28 with the targets, mitigation targets, transition away from fossil fuels, renewable resources, blah, blah, blah. But also we have two additional targets, the 33 and 34, which are related to zero, halting and reversing deforestation by 2030. So they push for having targets, sectoral targets, to be considered by parties in the context of their contributions to the reduction of emissions. And now, after Dubai, the first global stocktake, they are trying to introduce this target as a kind of prescriptive mitigation in somewhere in the negotiation, but in particular in the context of the mitigation work program. So, and this is really a step by step. They are developed countries. Well, I still have the hope that they will not achieve this in this COP. They are trying kind of successfully shifting, twisting the spirit of the Paris Agreement and of the convention, because, well, in the convention, well, we have the top-down approach and the obligation of developed countries to reduce emissions with a specific target. Later on, developed countries succeeded to have this bottom-up approach for all, but they are really moving into the next step, which is having top-down targets for developing countries. So in this history of the negotiations, there are really shifting completely the narrative and the obligations. They have the obligations at the beginning because they have the historical responsibility. Now they are trying to impose the obligations for the reduction of emissions to the developing countries. And they are trying to do now in this COP, introducing this top-down prescriptive mitigation, which is really against the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement is a facilitative, non-intrusive, non-punitive by nature. And all the parties, we should include our contributions in the context of the nationally determined the NDCs, respecting the national sovereignty. That's one part of the negotiation process that is happening now, and we see what will be the conclusion. But for Bolivia and for the LMDC, we cannot accept this kind of prescriptive mitigation, and assuming that in our NDCs we will need to accept different sectoral targets. And we cannot do that. First, because it is against the spirit of the Paris Agreement. And second, because we don't have the finance to do that. I can assume the obligations, but if I don't have the finance, how can I enhance mitigation action, assuming this a very specific and intrusive target? So there is no way out. It is really a madness what is happening here, pushing developing countries to assume more obligations, but avoiding any provision of financial resources. And that's what's happening in the negotiation on finance, because we have concluded to some extent 2 or almost 3 years of finance negotiations. And we have a text with different options, no more than that. So we have the options of developed countries, we have the options of developing countries, we have all the options in the text of 25 pages. And now the challenge is really how to move the issue of finance in the right direction, but knowing that those that have the legal obligations to provide finance, they don't have to fulfill their legal obligation. They should be ashamed to not fulfilling their legal obligations, should be ashamed of deleting equity and CBDR, but they are very proud of doing it. They are very proud challenging the principles of equity, CBDR, and they are very proud of really trying to dilute completely their legal obligations and the commitment to provide financial resources. And this is really shocking and disappointing. I'm really disappointed with this negotiation on finance because, all the options are open. As a developing country, we are expecting to have a important, significant provision of public finance in the context of the NCQG. And we put our options to have 1.3 trillion per year. And this is even not very close to the needs and priorities of developing countries, but trying to have some goal that we can negotiate, we put on the table $1.3 trillion per year, knowing that an important amount of the 1.3 trillion should be public, related to public finance. But the developed countries, in order to obscure, confuse the discussions and to move us to a different direction, they introduce, as usual, very creative, innovative approaches, talking about this global investment goal, trying to bring as the main financial provider to the private sector. So they are escaping out from the provision of the public finance, and they are really pushing for the private sector through the global investment goal to be the main provider of finance to developing countries. And also in that context, they introduced this idea of the multi-layered goal, like an onion, maybe, no? You peel the onion, you never go to the core, that's the core. No, so you will peel this belongs to the multilateral banks, this to the private sector, this to the loans, whatever, and we will never reach the core, which is the public finance. That's the idea of the multi-layered goal. In that context, well, we are supporting the single-layered goal to have a very clear goal, with the core being the public finance, which is related to the Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, which said that the financial flows go from the developed countries to developing countries. And even in the context of the global investment goals, developed countries are the beneficiaries of the goal, the developed countries. So they are really trying to also create a new narrative that the finance is not only for developing countries, but it's also for developed countries. And well, and also in the discussion, well, it is very important the issue of expanding the contributors base, well, which is against the Convention of Paris Agreement also. The expansion of the contributor base, well, is voluntary. If well, a developing country wants to assume the obligations of a developed country, of a Annex I country, is completely voluntary. Is beyond the scope of the NCQG. In that context, well, we really need to have some outcome in this COP. We cannot postpone this outcome for the next COP. As Meena said, well, the elephant in the room is the US. Well, we know that the US will leave the Paris Agreement. So having a negotiation on the NCQG, the next COP, will be really very, very difficult, almost impossible. So we really need to achieve some conclusion in this COP. It's not easy, it's difficult because, well, all the outcomes should be achieved by consensus. So we need to really create some kind of, well, consciousness on developed countries that they have to fulfill their obligations. So far, there is no political will in developed countries. They are really escaping, avoiding the figure of the goal, because a goal has to, well, the central part of the goal is the figure, how much, the amount of money to be provided, and they are really avoiding this discussion. But well, the ministerial consultations have started today, and they have really a very tough time to see how we are going to navigate in these 2-3 days or more, who knows, of negotiations to really have some agreement of the NCQG. But that's a picture. More ambition for developing countries through specific targets, but avoiding completely the responsibility to provide public finance, and all the finance go to the private sector. And that's why the interest also to really conclude the discussion of the Article 6, because, well, they will say at the end, well, you have the Article 6, you have the carbon markets for you to have some money. But this is really not the way forward in order for those that who really wants to solve the climate crisis. That's not the way forward, because, well, the private sector is interested in business, not in solving the planet and saving Mother Earth. Completely is out of their objectives and expectations to use the money in issues, for example, which are very important for our countries, adaptation, loss and damage. So, and there are many ministers from developed countries saying that the private sector is the mean to provide financial support for adaptation. Who will be, what enterprise will be interested to make business on adaptation in a community in Bangladesh, in Bolivia? No, that's really completely out of scope. But they are really pushing these kind of narratives to really keep away their goalposts, their responsibilities, and move everything to the private sector. As Bolivia, in this COP, we insisted very much that we should strengthen the perspective of the non-market approaches, and we brought here a proposal of the Mother Earth-centric actions, how we can introduce ecocentric approaches to this very anthropocentric convention. It was really a challenge to introduce this proposal, but we succeeded. And now we have the recognition of Mother Earth-centric actions in the context of non-market-based approaches, which I think is a good point also to continue working in these perspectives, because well, at the beginning we were very much alone, but now the world is really interested in supporting non-market-based approaches as one of the ways to address the challenges and the problems that have well with the markets and these ideas of only working with the Article 6.2 and 6.4. So we did our best, and I think we make good steps forward also in that direction. And on Thursday, we are also having an event, and I want to invite also to all of you for trying to provide more visibility to an issue that have been blocked for several years in this convention, the joint mitigation and adaptation approaches. We are organizing an event with the Troika presidencies in order to provide more visibility to non-market approaches in the context of joint mitigation and adaptation approaches. Because this is the issue really at stake. And yesterday in one conversation, I don't know if I have more time, Meena.
You have to go to a bilateral
Yeah.
at 7:30.
But that's the thing. In Bolivia, we started with proposals to really address issues of deforestation a lot of time ago, in 2015. But these proposals were really blocked by developed countries because they don't want to open any possibility to put pressure on them to provide public finance. And they blocked the joint mitigation and adaptation approaches, no market approach. But in Dubai, we have this goal of reducing or halting and reversing deforestation by 2030. How we can achieve the 2030 goal for Bolivian forests if we don't have the means to do it? And if we do it by 2030, Bolivia will be reaching the goal of net zero 20 years before than a developed country. Because developed countries are putting the goal by 2050. And they are putting pressure to Bolivia to achieve the net zero by 2030, 20 years earlier. And that is really the best example of the climate injustice. What they are trying to do, putting pressure to developing countries to achieve these goals by 2030. Meanwhile, they will achieve the goals by 2050. And for achieving the goal by 2030, what we can do? We are going to trap into different proposals related to the markets. And that's why Bolivia, in this kind of desperation, I don't know how to say, even put a proposal to have a $5 billion through the markets to achieve the net zero by 2030. Is any logic beyond what is happening here? putting pressure to the parties reacting in ways that they should, well, don't react like that. And well, while developed countries avoiding completely their financial responsibilities, this is a real madness. If we need really to protect the Paris Agreement as the way forward to solve the climate crisis, there is no more. We have the Paris Agreement. We should work with the Paris Agreement as much as we can. And that the solution is there. We cannot be creative, proposing innovative approaches, because are really creating a very complex scenario for the developing countries. So that is kind of my understanding of what's happening in this negotiation in the COP, and trying to provide some consciousness, some, I don't know what to say, but some positive spirit that we can do something very important for the planet, for Mother Earth, in the context of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, not diluting obligations, not diluting equity, not killing common but differentiated responsibilities, and really pushing for developed countries to provide public finance to developing countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diego. Unfortunately, he won't be able to stay until the end because he has got to go to a very important bilateral on just transition. So Ambassador Mo is somewhere in the halls. But just to say that we will continue until 8 o'clock. We have Professor Dr. Fadhel Kaboub with us, who is an economist. You're still in the Denison University. Yeah, and he's also with PowerShift Africa. So we're very happy to have him here. And they've done an incredible book on the just transition for Africa. And it's our pleasure to invite you to address the crowd.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Meena, for hosting this conversation. I will start by kind of building on what Diego just shared with us, kind of the frustration that we're seeing in these negotiations, and just to highlight that what we're dealing with here is power, real power. So you can come into these negotiations with the moral arguments, with the scientific arguments, but at the end of the day, if you don't have political, geopolitical leverage, real power to force the conversation into the direction that we'd like to see it towards justice, we're not going to make progress. And let me summarize for you how I see this climate finance conversation and how far we are from moving in the right direction. If you start with a simple scientific observation, an agreement that all of us have, which is there's a carbon budget. Some countries have exceeded their carbon budget by far and are running into deficits. And when you accumulate a deficit year after year, decade after decade, you have a debt. You have a climate debt. And the concept of debt is very simple, very straightforward in economics and finance and law. If I owe you $100, I pay you $100. You don't have to give me anything in return. We can sit down and negotiate a payment plan, but at the end of the day, you pay me $100. But in the context of climate finance, this is how things work. Instead of me giving you $100, I give you $3 and I tell you exactly what to do with it. And impose conditionalities and restrictions and KPIs and transparency and governance rules, everything. You have to follow my prescription. And then I feel bad because you clearly need more than $3. So I lend you $7, concessional rates, noblesse oblige, and tell you exactly what to do with it and set you up for economic entrapment, conditionalities and restrictions and all of that. And then I say, well, you clearly need more climate finance, so let's bring in the private sector. So what do? I give you $10, but you have to give me your forest to offset my pollution with pollution permits so I can continue my emissions. And now you have to protect that forest from its own people, the indigenous people that were the custodians of the forest. Kick them out to protect the carbon market territory. And then you clearly need more than that because we have a climate crisis. So I'm going to bring in more private sector. I'm going to give you another $20, but you have to produce green hydrogen for me, not for you. Right? And then I bring in green industrialization, quote unquote industrialization. So now all the assembly line manufacturing that I no longer need, I'm going to outsource it to you to use your green energy and your low cost labor to do assembly line manufacturing for me. And we call that climate finance. And you're sitting there looking at me and saying, wait a minute, where's my $100? Why am I borrowing money from you? Why am I giving you my forest? Why am I giving you my hydrogen? This is what we're dealing with. So climate debt should be paid in a very straightforward way, as far as I'm concerned. Grants, not loans, and further economic entrapment. Cancellation of all climate-related debts that our countries had to borrow to deal with the climate crisis. And transfer of life-saving technologies to manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure, clean transportation infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure, the building blocks of climate adaptation and resilience. We're talking about countries that are withholding life-saving technologies, like you have a vaccine for a disease, and you're withholding it from people who actually need it. That's climate finance. And from a global South perspective, climate finance is development finance. You can't separate the two. And I started my comments by saying this is about power, because there is an existing geopolitical hierarchy, power structure that is not meant to be disrupted. And if we unleash this climate finance that I described, the real climate finance, the transformative climate finance that we actually need, if we unleash it, then by definition, we disrupt that hierarchy. And that hierarchy is a colonial hierarchy that persists to this day. And people tell me, come on, Professor, colonialism is over, and let's talk about the other stuff. No, it's not. And here's why. Because colonial structures that were imposed on the global South persist to this day. And I can summarize them in 3 basic points. Number 1, we were supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that function today. Number 2, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output and technologies from the global North, from the industrialized world. We still play that function to this day. And number 3, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that's no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, job creation, technical assistance. But effectively what it does, it permanently locks us at the bottom of the global value chain. And we still play that role today. So when we unleash the climate finance that we want, by definition, it will create a disruption that will reposition the global South away from the bottom of the hierarchy. And that is perceived as a threat to be managed, as a risk to be eliminated. And that's why all of these negotiations, whether it's in the climate space or in the debt space or in the reform of the World Bank and the IMF, there are red lines in terms of how far you can go with reform, how far you can go with finance. The quality of finance is not supposed to be transformational, is not supposed to be disruptive to this hierarchy. That is the real thing. So later in my comments, I will lay out some potential geopolitical strategy that will give us the leverage to actually force the conversation in the right direction and stop these, this nonsense that we see in the context of climate finance. But here are, Meena, you mentioned the Just Transition report, which was published by the independent expert group on just transition and development. It's available on justtransitionafrica.org. What we try to do in that report is identify a long-term, coherent, comprehensive strategy from an African perspective, but it really applies across the global South in general, from an African perspective that will simultaneously address the development and debt, climate and energy needs of the continent. Because if you don't have a long-term comprehensive vision for yourself, I guarantee you, you're already part of somebody else's vision. And everybody has every right to have a vision for themselves, for their economic bloc, for their region. So do we. And if we are part of somebody else's vision, we're already part of the bottom of the hierarchy. And they will use their every tool they have, economic diplomacy, incentives, these negotiations, to nudge you into the position they want you to be in. And so far, that's been the position that was imposed on us. And when it comes to the question of external debt, which is for the African continent, this year alone, 2024 alone, Africa is paying $163 billion in debt service in 1 year. Now put that side by side with all the climate finance numbers. See where we are. In 1 year, we're paying $163 billion in debt service. And when you have that much debt, you have no fiscal policy space to invest in health or education or climate adaptation or anything. So what is the root cause of external debt? And now we'll identify the transformation that we need. The root cause of external borrowing in Africa is three things. Number one, food deficits, energy deficits, and manufacturing value-added deficits. That's why we need the transformation in that area. When I say food deficits, Africa today imports 85% of its food. When less than 100 years ago, we used to be the breadbasket for the rest of the world, for colonial powers. And that transformation didn't happen by accident. It's the rules of international trade and investment and agricultural subsidies in the north that made it impossible for our farmers to compete to produce the core crops, wheat and corn and rice and so on. And that is a major structural trap. Number two, energy deficits. When I talk about energy deficits, I include our biggest oil exporter in Africa, Nigeria, which imports, up until very recently, 100% of its gasoline from international markets. Angola, the second largest exporter, imports 80% of its fuel from international markets. Not by accident, by design. Again, the old fossil fuels energy system that we're trying to get rid of, we've always been denied access to technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, to refine oil, and denied access to financing too. And the new energy system we're trying to build, it's the same thing. We're systematically denied access to financing and technology to manufacture and deploy the infrastructure that we need. Africa today, according to IRENA, the last report from the International Renewable Energy Agency, can produce by 2040 1,000 times our anticipated energy needs. 1,000 times with existing renewables technology, not new innovations, and completely replace all the continent's fossil fuel exports. By 2040, this is within reach, technically possible. Yet, Africa is only allowed to have less than 2% of financing for renewables. Less than 2% from global financing that goes to renewables comes to Africa. Most of it is extractive, by the way, to produce electricity for Europe, green hydrogen for Europe, or to manufacture green stuff to export to the rest of the world. Why is this the case? Because if you take, say, for example, OPEC countries today, with their economic and geopolitical weight globally, multiply it by 1,000. That's Africa's potential. And that is perceived as a threat, not as an opportunity to decarbonize and transform the world economy. That's a threat to be managed, as a risk to be eliminated, right? So that's the second structural deficiency, energy deficits on the continent. And number three, the kind of manufacturing base that we were allowed to have in the global south in general is the kind where you have to import the machines, import the fuel to power the factories, import the intermediate components to assemble with low-cost labor, and even import the packaging. So you end up with a manufacturing base that produces low value-added content, and what we import is high value-added content. So you can double, triple, quadruple your exports with free trade agreements left and right. You're always locked at the bottom of the hierarchy. So with these three structural deficits, with the structural deficit, your currency becomes weaker relative to the dollar and the euro. And with the weaker currency, anything I import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, basic necessities, you import it at a higher price. So we literally import inflation and the most sensitive areas, food, fuel, and medicine. So that means our governments immediately have to protect the most vulnerable to avoid social uprisings. So what do? We subsidize food, we subsidize fuel, we subsidize health as much as possible, and we ask our central bankers to stabilize the exchange rate. That's their job. How do they stabilize it? They borrow more dollars and more euros and get us deeper into the debt trap. And now that we have debt denominated in dollars that you must service, I said $163 billion this year that Africa is paying, then all of your economic activity is rearranged to prioritize whatever can get you those dollars as quickly as possible. And that opens the floodgates for extractivism. That opens the floodgates for foreign direct investment to tell you exactly what they need from you so that they can come in and extract or do business on favorable terms to them. And that keeps you locked in that position. So the structural transformation that we need coincidentally happens to be a solution to all of these debt root causes, but they're also climate solutions, because that means we need strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology. That's one of the sources of the debt. That's also a climate solution. Strategic investments in renewable energy sovereignty. That's a source of the debt. That's a climate solution. And strategic investments in high value added industrial policies that prioritize our needs, which is renewable energy infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure, clean transportation infrastructure. That's a solution to debt, and that's a climate solution. So when we're serious about climate negotiations to address the real climate issues that we need in the global south, with the real financing that's not debt inducing, that's not, these tranquilizing drugs that they service, then we really create the structural transformation that repositions the global south away from the bottom of the global hierarchy, economically and geopolitically. And that is why the global north doesn't want to see that happen. Because that is the reality, that is the real possibility that's within reach. And the financing is available. There's plenty of money for this. There's plenty of technology. So like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in the context of the civil rights movement, he said, I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism, incrementalism, false solutions, dangerous distractions. And that's exactly what we see in this space, not just this year, but for the last 30 years. So the question is, how do we create the geopolitical leverage that will force the conversation in a different direction? And here, if you can allow me just 3 minutes, I'll take 3 minutes. Imagine for a second if we have a block of, say, 30 global south countries, excluding China for now, 30 global south countries that have the complementarity of resources and capabilities, that have all the critical minerals that we need, which is the case. We have them in the global south. We have the youngest labor force on the planet, on the African continent, for example. Imagine that bloc co-designing a joint industrial policy. Why joint industrial policy? Because we need the economies of scale. No country can industrialize alone, because you end up manufacturing a small component in somebody else's industrial policy. So a joint industrial policy, we have the resources, the labor, the economies of scale. What we lack is access to the manufacturing technology to deploy renewables at scale. Imagine that bloc designing their joint industrial policy on their own terms, with pre-negotiated terms about extractivism, about protecting local communities, about labor rights, about distribution of the profit share, everything pre-negotiated on terms that everybody in this room would like to see. Picture for a moment that we have that. How do we get the technology? And I'll share with you just one anecdote from last year, right before COP. A senior editor at a major newspaper that all of you probably read, guarantee you read, who's very familiar with this conversation, with these issues, texted me and said, you cannot believe this 3-hour off-the-record interview I had with senior official in the OECD about industrialization, about transfer of technology. The 3 hours off the record, the gist of it is the following. Nobody in the global south is allowed to industrialize without our approval. This is November 2023, not 1823. That is the reality. So how do you create the leverage to change that position? So imagine that block now going to a country like China that happens to have the entire value chain that we would like to replicate. Value chain is available everywhere else. But imagine going to China and saying, look, we give you the bargain of the century. If you replicate the value chain on our terms in this block to manufacture and deploy, say, solar at scale, here's what we give you. In 10 to 15 years, you double your industrial footprint globally. In 10 to 15 years, you double your geopolitical weight globally. And you secure your access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. In addition to that, thanks to the recent trade restrictions on Chinese EVs in Europe and the US and so on, we, the Global South, we're the largest market on the planet. We're the global majority, except we don't have purchasing power yet. But if we truly industrialize and develop, we can offer potentially the largest market for Chinese EVs. I guarantee you China will take this bargain. But just triggering this process, we don't actually have to finish it, immediately gives us the bargaining chip we need in this space and all the other multilateral spaces. Now we can go with that second bargaining chip and say, look, we give you guys the same bargain that we just gave to China. Go to Germany, for example, and say, we give you the same bargain if you transfer technology to manufacture and deploy wind turbine technology on our terms in the Global South as joint venture. This is not charity. This is partnership, real partnership. We go to France and say, we want high-speed rail, joint venture, partnership, manufactured, deployed in the Global South on our terms. Go to the US, say we want pharmaceutical technology, whatever building blocks of development we need and technology we're restricted from having, we say we give you the same deal. We're the global majority. We're the largest market. We have all the resources for this. At that point, nobody can say, no, 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 we don't partner like this. We only do neocolonial extraction. Why? Because they know if they say, no, we're not giving you wind turbine technology, China has wind turbine technology, high-speed rail technology, pharmaceutical. The idea of this geopolitical bargain is not to position China at the top of the hierarchy, but rather to reposition the Global South at the center of a new international economic order. And at that point, when you have real development and industrialization, using our own critical minerals, then the rest of the world will realize there isn't actually enough critical minerals globally for the Global South to develop the way I described, and for Europe to continue with its Green Deal, because it's a growth deal, obsessed with consumerism and energy waste and growth and planned obsolescence. The same with the American IRA. So now we force a conversation about degrowth in the global north, about a circular economy, about living within the planetary boundaries for real, not for just talk. And this is where labor comes in at the end of this conversation, because if we in the Global South, our workers are no longer available for low-cost assembly line manufacturing because we're busy doing high value-added manufacturing, then workers in the global north are protected. Their jobs are no longer outsourceable. Their social protection is intact. And now we force the conversation about who's really behind labor displacing technology, who's really gaining from this, blaming immigrants and workers in the South for workers in the North losing their jobs and social protection. So we force the conversation about income distribution, about who's grabbing the profit share from industrialization and development globally. So this is the kind of leverage that we need based on what Diego was describing and what all of us are seeing for 30 years now, 29 years in this space. Without that geopolitical leverage, without the threat of saying this deal doesn't work for us, try again. Without the threat of saying we're going to walk away because this doesn't work for us. Without the leverage that says, if you don't really engage with us on good faith terms, then you may not actually have access to any of these critical minerals because we're busy using them, right? On our terms. We're not going to have a real balance, right? In this process. And that is what I'm describing here is really within reach. Technically, politically, within reach, but it requires unity. That initial block, right, requires real political commitment and courage, which that political commitment and courage gives our negotiators here the mandate to say, try again. This is not working for us. And we as a bloc, as a G77 bloc, we will not settle for crumbs. We will not settle for these tranquilizing drugs. And I really think this is possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fadhel. I think that was really truly insightful. And then I saw, despite the tired faces, people were actually listening very closely. And at least from the bleakness of how difficult this is, but the hope that there exists if there is unity in the global south. Now, Ambassador Mo, unfortunately, is not able to make it. He's been called for into a ministerial. We expected this. Negotiators are always very busy to come to a panel like this, particularly in the second week. Now, we have about half an hour. So maybe we will invite some questions. And if you have, and then we can see, what people would like to discuss, whether negotiations, whether a new world order, whatever. Anybody? Is there a mic around? Yes. Yes, please. And it'd be good if you identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Aruna Chandrasekhar from Carbon Reef. I think it was interesting also that you talked towards the end of your conversation about the IRA, about CBAM. Now, that was one of the leading pushes from the basic countries at the start of the negotiations. It was another year in a row where it was not included and not put on the agenda. Any idea where that is being accommodated? That goes into consultations. It's another thing that gets bumped in this process. And we are all like looking at how, a Trump presidency and what is its impact on the NCQG, but we're not looking at these sorts of real world impacts. It will be good to get a sense on that. And I think Diego was pretty clear on, the history of, or why developing countries are pushing back against mitigation language in the UAE dialogue or in the mitigation work program. But if there's something you would specifically like to speak to that or to explain to audiences, that would be really helpful.
Okay, that's a very big question, but good. I just want to also give you a feedback that right now we are really deadlocked on adaptation. There is no appetite, actually not even deadlocked, we are gone past the hour, in the national adaptation plans that many developing countries have put in place. There is no money for implementation. So one of the big discussions and negotiations was actually to have a text which would facilitate the implementation of the National Adaptation Plan. The US put a big bracket on means of implementation. The text could not be agreed to. So postponed again. So adaptation on the National Adaptation Plans, down. Just transition, they don't want to discuss anything but mitigation. Of not about the transition, but about, again, the same paragraph 28, obsession with the global efforts on mitigation efforts. So that's what they want to discuss. They want to discuss, so the just transition is an unjust transition because you're supposed to talk about the transition in a just way, not just for mitigation, but adaptation, poverty eradication, and the whole gamut of the scope of the just transition work program. Now that's not going well at all. On the issue of the UAE dialogue, for those of you who don't know, but some of you who know, like Carbon Brief, that was actually one of the works, the follow-up of the global stocktake processes, where there is a paragraph 97. Please read the Third World Network updates. You will understand exactly what we're talking about, because that UAE dialogue from Dubai, when it was adopted, it was under the means of implementation finance section. When we landed in Bonn early this year, mid-June, the big question was, is it a dialogue on finance or is it a dialogue on all GST outcomes? So that's where there was a lot of wrangling and caused the delay in the opening of the agenda, because the developed countries wanted that to be not under matters relating to finance, but rather as all GST outcomes. So that has been the push and pull in the negotiations. Now, why is it important to have a finance only discussion? You have at the moment where the UAE dialogue is basically a few options on the table. The developed country option is they want to talk about all GST outcomes. Many developing countries don't want it, but there are some alliances like the SIDS and the LDCs and even ILAC. They don't mind talking about finance and other issues. But there is a large group of countries, including the Africa group, the like-minded group, and the Arab group, who say no, it is a finance discussion. And the reason why this is the case is because there is no process to talk about the finance. The long-term finance discussion for the 100 billion will end in 2027, and that's about the $100 billion. There is no discussion about the finance for now and finance for the future. And by the way, the new collective quantified goal on finance is for current NDC implementation. It's not about paragraph 28 implementation. So I think many of us are not aware of that. And I'm surprised that we have not dug into the details of it. Just to repeat that, since it's a very long day, and I hope you are patient with me, we have time. So the point about the new collective quantified goal on finance was actually a process based on the needs of developing countries. And that was agreed to from the in 2015 in Paris. So the needs determination report, which was then a process that the Standing Committee on Finance was supposed to look at the actual needs and priorities. So what did they do? They looked at the nationally determined contributions of parties, the national adaptation plans, the technology needs assessments, and then they pooled all this together, including on the adaptation needs and so on, and came up with a range of between 5 to 6 trillion or so for 5 years. And so that's based on current needs, and that is until 2030. The new collective quantified goal on finance is for that time frame. The global stocktake decision on the global mitigation efforts is about your next NDC, which is 2031 to 2035. And countries are only now going to be submitting their NDC. So there's no assessment of needs as of now in terms of what it would mean for a real energy transition, what it would mean for a phasing out of fossil fuels. There is no assessment at the moment. So how can you link the NCQG for a future goal? That doesn't work. So the 1.6 trillion per year or 3 trillion per year that is being asked has to be trillions, not the peanuts which are there in the text. So what we need to really understand is that the scale of the finance for the transition is phenomenal. And so I recall reading an article by Colombia, and they have put in that for their energy transition, and they are facing, when they want to phase out from fossil fuels, and they put a $10 billion amount. And that's for Colombia alone. Take all the developing countries, okay, can exclude the richer countries, but take that, it's significant. And so this is where we are at in terms of the scale of the financing. And that is why I will leave to Fadhel to talk about investments, but we need to recognize that the finance issue is absolutely critical. And so you cannot just link everything to a mitigation discussion, which is what they want to do. How are you doing your mitigation? We want to turn it into an investment plan. Your nationally determined contribution is supposed to be an investment plan to attract the private sector. For the longest time, developing countries have been doing investment plans and money is not flowing enough. Fadhel, you will talk about that, I'm sure. But so this is where there is a real problem. So the UAE dialogue, this is where the wrangle is. The developed countries are hell-bent on mitigation everywhere. That's why I started off by saying, who is wrecking the mitigation? Why is 1.5 not achievable? That's exactly what Diego was talking about. Who's exhausted the carbon budget? Who is going for net zero by 2050 when they should go net negative now? There is no space for developed countries to go net zero by 2050. So in Glasgow, they pulled off the biggest con in the planet. It was really a con game. That, I have said this before, I've called it out and I've called it a fraud. Many people don't understand the details. Everybody goes and champions the slogan, and we all do, keep 1.5 alive. But when I hear the US negotiators in the hall here talk about keeping 1.5 alive, I don't know whether to cry or laugh. When you exit the Paris Agreement, how the hell are you going to keep 1.5 alive? And yet you are wanting to prescribe what developing countries must do. The second thing is you can't keep 1.5 alive with all these kinds of net zero, which is far off. You have to do net zero much earlier. And that too, many of us are saying you cannot allow the carbon offsets from developing countries. What is carbon offsets for developing countries? The more emission reductions we do, which count to their emission reductions, what does that mean? We have to do much more emissions reductions. So how are we going to do that? So these are the fundamental reasons that we really need to interrogate in terms of the solution. That's why in Paris, the Paris Agreement very clearly says, it doesn't say net zero. It talks about balance between emissions and sinks by mid-century. It's a global target, not a national target. But the UK managed to have a deal which said net zero for all, and everybody clapped. By net zero for all, we are all going to save the world. 1.5 is going to be achieved. That is the biggest BS on earth. It can't. I'm sorry, I'm not a diplomat. And so I can't afford to say these things. So it really is really a big, huge issue. So all our NDCs, net zero, net zero, net zero. But how do you achieve that net zero? And so this is where we come to the crunch. Who is really responsible for the hugest emissions gap and for the temperature rise that is happening? Not to mention the fact that adaptation needs are growing. We are all facing it. Loss and damage is growing. So if you were a government, and let me end on this one. If you were a developing country government, if you don't have resources, and quite apart from the debt servicing that you have to do, you can't feed your people, they go hungry, and your medical health and all that and so on. If you have limited resources, there is a typhoon or a flood that comes and wipes out your people. Are you going to be talking about emission reductions, or are you going to be talking about adaptation and loss and damage? What would you do? Adaptation and loss and damage. That's what you would do, right? So this is where I think we need to really understand the reality of developing countries and the kind of crises that they're facing. And this is where I think, I completely agree with Fadhel, we need a new world and we need a real power shift, as you have in your name. But that will take a little bit more time. So maybe you can deal, I hope I've answered your question. And maybe now you can deal with the other questions.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I'm not going to be the diplomat either. I'll focus on the investment goal. And if you think about it, the combination of the investment goal and CBAM regulations is the most dangerous combination in the climate space, probably for the next decade and beyond. And here's what I mean by that. CBAM is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's a carbon tax that the European Union is imposing on products that are entering the EU that have, carbon content, essentially. If you think about it, the green industrial zone in Namibia, the green steel investment in Mauritania, for example, huge investments in renewable energy infrastructure, not for Namibia, not for Mauritania or the rest of the continent, but to produce the clean electricity that will feed into a manufacturing process in Namibia, in Tanzania, in Mauritania, in the case of steel. And now you produced green steel. So that green steel from Mauritania enters the EU market without paying the CBAM tax because it's green. So in reality, you're reproducing the same economic hierarchy and role that the Global South played during colonial times. Mauritania is now using low-cost labor, low-cost energy to extract green steel, that it goes into the EU market. And now from the EU perspective, that CBAM regulation is an inflation management tool that is keeping the cost of steel low, because all other steel comes in with a higher tax. And it's a trade weapon against the EU's competitors, like steel coming from Japan or Brazil or Korea that's not green yet has to pay the CBAM tax. So now guess what? You have this new investment goal that the entire global north is pushing for to become the main climate finance thing. And the UK is already introducing its CBAM regulation. It's coming in online soon. The US, Canada, Australia, Japan, they're all preparing their CBAM regulations. And as soon as they do, they're going to flood the climate finance numbers with green industrial zones in the south, to outsource all the assembly line manufacturing that they no longer need and the obsolete technologies to be done in these green industrial zones, so that then they export the products back to their economies without paying the CBAM tax. Therefore, locking us again at the bottom of the hierarchy with this green extractivism to greenwash, rinse, and repeat the same process. So that's why the investment goal is now the priority, because the CBAMs are coming. And this is, again, yet another innovation in this long process of serving as tranquilizing drugs and false solutions. And it's designed to reproduce the exact same economic hierarchy. And it's called climate finance.
You asked about where is this being discussed? Good question. We are in a stadium and we are playing football. But they are trying to have penalty shots with rules which are being rigged here by themselves. They don't follow what's there in the convention. And even in the GST, there's an outcome which talks about Article 3.5, that any measure that you do cannot be protectionist. And they argue that it's not protectionist. It's really for genuine climate goals. As far as I understand it, it's not, of course, there's no place in the agenda. In the Just Transition Work Program, developing countries have raised it. The developed world will not agree. And I think the final possibility, I'm not sure, I'll have to check with Hillary, the response measures agenda as a work plan or activity to discuss. Is that agreed? No, see, not agreed as yet. So developing countries say, okay, response measures, activity, we discuss it, have a discussion. No. Right? So can you imagine a serious carbon border measure, which is so important, and this is also the same with intellectual property rights. In the UNFCCC and in the Paris Agreement, these three words cannot be talked about. The minute you talk intellectual property for technology, you are told, look, this is private sector, this is WTO, don't talk about it in the UNFCCC. You go to the WTO, they say this is a climate matter, we can't, you have to implement the TRIPS agreement, of course. So you see, we are playing football in a stadium. And so the only thing they want to talk about, paragraph 28 on the energy transition, without the finance, without the technology transfer, and this is the only game in town. Now, it cannot be the only game in town, and we will not allow them to have the only game in town. So I think I'll stop there. Are there any other questions? I hope we've energized you to ask questions. So please identify yourself.
Thank you, and very interesting discussion here. I'm from Bangladesh. My name is Ajat. So we are talking about all that problems, all that issues we are created in the years past. What is the way forward? What is the solution for Global South and the relation between the Global South and North? How can we minimize the conflict between the interest of Global South and North? What is the way forward to solution? Thank you.
Fadhel had a very big, deep answer to that solution. I have a very simple answer. Please honor the agreements you have made under the Paris Agreement and under the convention. The agreement is there. Don't shift. They all agreed in Paris. They come here, CBDR, no reference to convention. So who is not honoring? So that's a very simple answer. How do you want the global North and the global South? This is a treaty. This is a legal honor the obligations that are there. And that's my simple response. Don't play havoc. Yes. Mike over here, please.
I'm Mustafa. I work for Oxfam and I'm based in Pakistan. Do you think like WTO negotiations fizzled out after Doha round and nothing happening? Will this also go like that way? That path in future is nothing happening, nobody honors, and people just coming here for tourism, 60,000 people. And at the end, if there's no proper agreement, will this negotiation of COP fizzle out in future?
Now, if it fizzles out, the world will fizzle out. So this is why many of us are constantly asked, I'm sure you want to respond as well. Again. Now, the thing is, WTO is another problem. It's another matter because those are about trade negotiations. And a lot of the times, actually, if you want to follow Third World Network on trade, we have shown how a lot of that agreements, they're actually not fair to developing countries. And even the agriculture agreement, which they had agreed to in removing a lot of the subsidies, they never did it. And they shift the color. As you know, Oxfam has done a lot of work on that. And so they continue. So they want a peace clause and they don't want to implement the agriculture agreement. In the TRIPS agreement for trade and intellectual property rights, you want flexibility and all that. They don't want to agree on it. So that's another can of worms. And what we did prevent was actually the new issues that they wanted, an investment agreement, which would have locked all developing countries, particularly in not being able to regulate their do policies. The multinationals and the private sector would have gone to town happily without any regulation. So luckily we prevented that. But then came the bilateral free trade agreements, the investment agreements and all that. So for many of us, we've been trying to educate governments, please be careful. These are agreements which are drafted by the big transnationals. They lock you in and they don't allow you to get out. Just to give you one example, I know I'm going a little bit further, but there is time. There is a link between the free trade agreements and the policy space of free trade agreements and what you have to do on the climate side. There is an energy charter which the EU had negotiated, and many of those countries which wanted to go to stop fossil fuels, like for instance, Germany, they wanted to move away from power plant, nuclear energy because of Fukushima. The energy charter did not allow them to do it because the company can sue you for billions of dollars. So this is what free trade agreements do and investment agreements do. So in terms of the just transition, this is the other thing that we are saying. You can't have these agreements which are actually not allowing developing countries to do the right thing. Or the credit rating agencies, when you like Colombia, when they announced the president was progressive, he announced that Colombia was going to phase out of fossil fuels. The credit rating agencies downgraded Colombia. So here you want us to do ambition, there you downgrade, peso went down, get into a debt crisis, and they get into more problems. So this is what Fadhel was talking about. This is streams that actually lock you in. So we cannot afford to leave this process to others. They will be very happy if civil society never came, if we didn't hold the developed countries in particular to any accountability, then there is no way they can actually keep, they can just walk out and pretend as if nothing is real. But the implications of doing that are serious for us, because climate change is a global problem. If you have a trade issue and if you don't do this or don't do that in your own country, that's fine. Doesn't have any implication other than, domestic. But here, whatever other countries don't do, and our impacts are pretty serious. So you can't afford to let it fizzle. We can't afford to fizzle. We have to be here. Many of us were not happy with the outcome in Paris, but I tell you, they wanted a mitigation-centric agreement in Paris. Read this, right? We have copies of that there. Read this. It shows you. They were only interested in a mitigation-centric agreement which would replace the Kyoto Protocol, and they were not interested in adaptation. They were not interested in loss and damage. They were not interested in common but differentiated responsibility. But we fought, and there is a balance there. So let it not fizzle out. I think we have no choice. We have absolutely no choice. Yes, somebody is indicating time. I think we've got 5 minutes to go, or do we have one more question? 4 minutes.
Hello, I'm Paloma. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's super helpful. And I have a question for Fadhel. There is a part, I have already asked this in another instance, but I just would like you to just explain a little bit more about this. There was a moment in that you talked about the fact that the global south, we are the largest market and we have the resources, so we will be able to, let's say, if we do have the manufactured produce energy to sustain our own communities, and also, I mean, still continue to import, I guess, and at some point we will realize that we actually don't have enough resources, and then shift to a conversation towards the growth or something along those lines. And so I was wondering, when we talk about, okay, we will be able finally to industrialize, to develop, but how do we make sure that doesn't happen at the expenses of nature in a way that doesn't really continue to reproduce the same logics of extraction? And yeah, just if you could talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very briefly, what I meant by that is that the actual volume of critical minerals that is available today, if you take the EU green growth, the US IRA, green industrialization, and the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, all of the major blocks, their plans will mean that all the existing critical minerals will be consumed by them and there'll be nothing for the global south. But if we industrialize in the way that I described, then we'll be consuming quite a bit of the critical minerals that we have on our terms, including, as I said, we set the terms for labor rights, human rights, extractivism that you and I agree on, which means some areas will be untouchable, some minerals will not be extractable on our terms. That means the rest of the world has to think about their own growth model and start thinking about degrowth in the global north, reducing planned obsolescence, investing in research and development in material science research to reduce waste. All of that is now not even on the table for discussion. They're just assuming they'll keep growing with the same obsession with consumerism and all of that. So to force that conversation so that we really live within planetary boundaries, we have to start with actual development in the global south. Otherwise, they're just assuming that we'll stay at the bottom with no resources.
Okay, thank you. I hope this was useful. You can follow us on the TWN updates. In fact, you go to the daily schedule, you will see that if you go in terms of negotiations, you will see at the bottom the link, but you can just Google and we are there. So we'll tell you what's happening every day. Okay, so have a good evening.